The decision. Dr. Aaron Gray had always believed he lived a life of purpose. As a pediatrician, every day brought new faces and new stories. But when he came home each night, his house felt emptier than it should. After the death of his wife, Emma, 5 years ago, he had thrown himself into his work, hoping that the bustle of patients and hospital calls would keep the aching hole in his chest at bay. Emma had been the love of his life, his best friend, and the one person who truly understood him. Their love had been a quiet one, no extravagant gestures or grand declarations, but it had been a deep, unshakable bond. They had shared dreams of starting a family, of building a home filled with laughter and warmth. But that dream was abruptly shattered when Emma passed away suddenly due to an unforeseen illness. The grief Aaron had felt was all-consuming. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed or felt truly alive. In the years since her death, Aaron had become a shell of the man he once was. His friends and family had tried to reach out, urging him to move on, but they didn't understand. How could they? No one could know the depth of the loss he felt. The house that had once been filled with joy now stood silent, its walls echoing with memories of a time long gone. One cold evening, after a particularly grueling shift at the hospital, Aaron found himself walking through the quiet streets of his neighborhood. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, but Aaron couldn't bring himself to appreciate the beauty. His mind wandered back to Emma, as it often did these days. She had been his everything. And now, she was just a memory that haunted him at every corner. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a notification from a local charity event. Aaron had always been one to give back, but after Emma's passing, even his charitable work had started to feel hollow. As he read the message, he came across an announcement for a fundraiser benefiting a nearby orphanage. It caught his attention, but not in the way it might have once. There was an odd sensation inside him, a stirring, something deep in his gut that made him pause. Without really thinking, Aaron walked to the community center the following afternoon. He wasn't sure why he was there. Maybe it was the reminder of how much love and care children needed, or perhaps, somewhere deep down, it was the quiet longing for something more, something he couldn't quite define. The orphanage was a small, well-kept building on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was home to children who had lost everything. The moment Aaron stepped inside, he was greeted by the soft sounds of laughter and chatter. The children seemed to radiate an energy that was contagious, but even so, he couldn't shake the sense of sadness that lingered in the air. As he walked through the rooms, speaking with the staff and seeing the kids, his heart began to feel heavier, as though the weight of their unspoken struggles was pressing down on him. And then he saw her. Zuri. She was sitting in a corner of the playroom, far from the other children. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and she had a vacant look on her face as she stared at the wall. She couldn't have been older than 8, but there was something haunting about the way she held herself. The other kids were laughing and playing, but Zuri sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, barely moving. It was as if she didn't belong in this world at all. The orphanage staff had mentioned her briefly when Aaron asked. Zuri had been with them for nearly a year, and although she was an intelligent girl, she hadn't spoken a word since her arrival. The staff didn't know why, but they assumed it was a result of the trauma she had experienced before being placed in their care. Zuri's story, as they told it, was a tragic one. Abandoned by her parents and left to fend for herself at a young age. They had tried everything to get her to speak, but she refused. Aaron's heart went out to her. There was something about the way Zuri looked at him that made him feel both helpless and determined. He didn't know her, but in that moment, he felt a deep connection, a pull toward her that he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the emptiness that still lingered in his own heart, the same emptiness he saw reflected in her eyes. Maybe it was the fact that, like him, Zuri seemed to be carrying a burden far too heavy for someone so small. The other children seemed to accept Zuri's silence. They didn't push her or try to force her to play. But Aaron, as he stood there watching her, couldn't help but wonder what could be done. What did she need? What would it take to bring her back from the brink of whatever darkness she had experienced? Later that day, after he had left the orphanage and returned to his home, Aaron couldn't shake the image of Zuri from his mind. Her sad eyes, the way she seemed so lost in her own world. His heart ached as he thought about how much she had already suffered in her short life. And then it hit him, the realization that he could offer her something. He could give her a home. He could help her find a way out of the silence that seemed to trap her. It wouldn't be easy. There were so many unknowns. How could he help someone who wouldn't even speak? How could he, someone who had barely been able to move forward after losing Emma, possibly take on the responsibility of raising a child? But as the days passed, the idea took root in Aaron's mind. He couldn't ignore the feeling that perhaps, in some strange, inexplicable way, this was the path he was meant to walk. Maybe this was the chance he needed to heal. Maybe taking care of Zuri would give him something he had longed for without even knowing it. A sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. So, after much deliberation, Aaron made the decision. He would adopt Zuri. He would give her the love and security she needed, and in return, she would give him something he never expected: hope. The process wasn't easy. There were mountains of paperwork, background checks, and numerous meetings with social workers. But none of that mattered to Aaron. He was determined to make it work. When the day finally came for him to bring Zuri into his home, he felt a rush of emotions: nervousness, excitement, and even fear. How would she adjust? Would she accept him? Would she ever speak? But when he saw Zuri standing at the door of the orphanage, a small duffel bag in her hand, he knew there was no turning back. She looked at him with those same big eyes, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her gaze. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had accepted him. Together, they walked out of the orphanage, hand in hand, stepping into the unknown. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, Aaron felt like he was no longer alone. A new beginning. The first few days after Zuri arrived in Aaron's home felt like a delicate dance, tentative, fragile, and unsure. As the door clicked shut behind them, sealing Zuri's arrival, Aaron was met with the weight of what he had just done. It wasn't simply about providing a roof over her head. It was about becoming her family, becoming her safe space, and that felt like a monumental responsibility. The house, which had once been filled with the echoes of his laughter with Emma, now seemed unfamiliar and cold. Zuri's presence filled the empty corners, but not in the way Aaron had hoped. The silence between them was thick, like a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. Zuri's room, a small but cozy space, sat at the far end of the hallway. Aaron had made sure it was bright and inviting. Pastel colors on the walls, a bed with soft blankets, and a little corner nook filled with stuffed animals and books. But Zuri didn't touch the toys, nor did she explore her room in the way Aaron had expected. She simply sat on the bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes staring vacantly ahead. Aaron had tried to engage with her. He tried to draw her in with warm, welcoming conversations, offering snacks and activities she might enjoy. But the result was always the same. Zuri would glance up at him, a look of uncertainty in her eyes, and then look away again, retreating further into herself. Each morning, Aaron would greet her with a soft, "Good morning, Zuri," but she never responded. He would give her simple choices, like asking if she wanted cereal or toast for breakfast, but she would only stare at the food with a neutral expression, not making a sound or even a gesture. It was as though she had forgotten how to engage with the world, or perhaps she was afraid to do so. Aaron didn't push her. He knew it was going to take time. He had read enough about trauma to understand that healing wasn't something that could be rushed. He had to be patient, to give her the space she needed. But the longer the silence stretched on, the heavier the atmosphere grew in the house. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on them, trapping both of them in a quiet, unspoken loneliness. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Aaron found himself sitting in the living room, reading through some case files from the hospital, but his mind kept wandering back to Zuri. He glanced over at her, sitting across the room in the same spot where she had been all evening. Her head was down, and she was fiddling with the hem of her sleeve, something she did often when she was anxious. "Zuri," Aaron said gently, putting down the files and turning his full attention to her. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond right away. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Then, slowly, Zuri lifted her head and met his gaze. There was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Aaron hadn't seen before. It was raw, unguarded, a look of deep sorrow that Aaron couldn't fully comprehend. I know you're scared," Aaron continued softly, hoping she could hear the sincerity in his voice. "But you don't have to be. You're safe here, Zuri. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but you can always talk to me if you feel ready." Her eyes flickered to him for just a second, as if weighing his words, before she looked away again. She didn't say anything, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight loosening of the tight grip she had on her sleeve. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time, Aaron felt like she was beginning to trust him, even if just a little. Days turned into weeks, and the silence continued to reign in Aaron's home. But the more he observed Zuri, the more he began to notice small changes, tiny gestures, things that no one else might have picked up on. But to Aaron, they were monumental. Zuri began to respond to simple commands. If Aaron asked her to hand him a book or to sit at the dinner table, she would do so without hesitation. Her movements were still slow, almost mechanical, as if she were still unsure about what was expected of her. But there was a spark in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The dullness that once clouded her gaze had begun to fade, and in its place was a flicker of curiosity. Aaron made sure to be patient with her, never forcing her to do anything she wasn't ready for. He would sit with her during meals, offering her quiet companionship, letting the silence speak for itself. Some nights, they would sit together in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting soft shadows around them, as he read aloud to her from a book. She never spoke, but she always listened. There was one evening, several weeks into Zuri's stay, when Aaron came home from a long day at the hospital. He found her sitting by the window in her room, looking out into the night. The room was dark except for the moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting silver beams across the floor. "Zuri," Aaron called softly as he entered the room. Zuri turned her head slightly, but didn't fully look at him. She just sat there, her small body tense. Aaron approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "I brought you some ice cream," he said, holding up a bowl of her favorite flavor. "I thought we could have a little treat tonight." Zuri didn't react at first. She just stared at the ice cream as though it were something foreign. Aaron set the bowl on the table beside her and took a seat next to her, waiting. Minutes passed, and Aaron didn't say a word. He let her take her time, knowing that pushing her to speak or act before she was ready wouldn't help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Zuri reached out and took the spoon in her hand. She looked up at Aaron, her eyes briefly meeting his. For the first time since she arrived, she allowed herself to smile, a faint, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. Aaron's heart swelled with pride and relief. "You like it?" he asked gently. Zuri didn't answer, but the smile she gave him was enough. It was a small victory, but it was one Aaron knew he would treasure. It was a sign that, bit by bit, Zuri was beginning to trust him, to open up. That night, as they sat together in the quiet of the house, the warmth of the ice cream and the small connection they had made lingered in the air. Zuri may not have spoken a single word, but for the first time since her arrival, Aaron felt like they were moving in the right direction. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or what the journey ahead would look like, but for the first time, he felt hope. He knew they would make it, together. The unspoken truth. The months passed by in a quiet rhythm, an ebb and flow of familiar routines. Zuri, though still largely silent, had begun to adjust to her new life with Aaron. The little house, which had once felt too large and empty for just one person, now had a warmth to it, filled with unspoken promises and tentative steps toward healing. They still shared most of their time in silence, but there were moments when the quiet wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. And in that peace, Erin began to see glimpses of who Zuri truly was beneath the walls she had built around herself. Though she rarely spoke, Zuri had begun to show more interest in the world around her. She would point to things she wanted, whether it was a toy or a book, and Erin would happily oblige. She never made any verbal requests, but her eyes spoke volumes, more than enough for Erin to understand. She was beginning to find her voice in small, silent ways, and it was in these moments that Erin felt a quiet joy. One evening, while Erin was sitting at the kitchen table preparing dinner, Zuri wandered in from the living room and stood at the doorway, watching him. Her presence had become so familiar that Erin no longer felt the need to fill every silence with words. Instead, he simply nodded to her, a small gesture that had become their unspoken way of acknowledging each other. "Do you want to help me?" Erin asked, not looking up from his chopping board, but sensing her gaze on him. Zuri hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, her movements slow but purposeful. She stood beside him, watching his every move with intent eyes. Erin smiled and handed her a small plastic knife, one of the tools he had set aside for her. "You can help me chop the vegetables," he said softly. Zuri took the knife in her small hand, her fingers gripping it carefully as she mimicked his movements. There was something oddly comforting about the quiet collaboration, Erin preparing the meal, Zuri standing beside him, occasionally glancing up at him as if waiting for approval. Though she didn't speak, the silent cooperation between them felt like progress. It was a language of its own. Over the following weeks, Zuri began to show more signs of engagement, though still not through words. She would point to pictures in books, asking Erin to tell her the story behind them. At night, she would often sit with him by the fireplace, leaning against him as he read aloud from her favorite books. She loved stories about faraway lands, about people overcoming obstacles, and about magic that could change the world. Erin's voice, deep and soothing, would fill the quiet room, and Zuri would listen with rapt attention, her eyes wide as she followed each word. But even as she absorbed the stories, she remained silent, her own thoughts locked away. It was one evening, as the first hints of spring began to warm the air, that things began to shift in a way neither of them had expected. Erin had been spending a lot of time with Zuri recently, noticing the way her eyes would flicker with curiosity when he spoke of the world outside their home. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Erin turned to her with a question. "You've been quiet for so long, Zuri," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you're not ready to talk yet, and I don't want to push you. But I need you to know, whenever you're ready, I'll listen." Zuri didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. It was the longest moment of silence they had shared in weeks, and for a second, Erin feared that they were stuck in the same place they had been when she first arrived. But then, unexpectedly, Zuri spoke. I don't want to talk." Her voice was small, hesitant, but it was there, soft and fragile, like a bird just learning to fly. Erin's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and unsteady, as if Zuri were testing the waters. "Why not?" Erin asked quietly, his voice full of compassion. He didn't want to push her, but there was a quiet yearning in his chest to understand her better, to reach the part of her that had remained silent for so long. Zuri's eyes dropped to her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting nervously. "Because, if I talk, it's real," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the soft evening breeze. "And I don't want it to be real." Erin sat back in his chair, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He had suspected for some time that Zuri's silence wasn't just a result of her trauma. It was a defense mechanism, a way to protect herself from the overwhelming truth of her past. Talking meant confronting her pain, and Zuri was terrified of that. "I'm so sorry, Zuri," Aaron said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could take away your pain. But I promise you, you don't have to do this alone." Zuri's eyes flickered up to his, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but finding none. There was nothing but warmth in Aaron's eyes, and something else, something softer, something that made her feel safe, even in the face of her darkest memories. "I know," Zuri whispered, "but it still hurts." The confession hung in the air like a cloud, heavy and laden with years of unspoken grief. Aaron didn't have the words to make it better. He didn't know how to fix Zuri's broken heart. But he knew this: she didn't have to face it alone. Not anymore. From that moment on, Aaron made a promise to himself. He would be there for Zuri, no matter how long it took for her to find her voice, no matter how much she struggled with the pain that lurked beneath the surface. And slowly, over the next few weeks, Zuri began to speak more often, still in fits and starts, still with a hesitancy that pulled at Aaron's heart. But each word, each sentence, was a small victory. She would tell him about the places she imagined, the worlds she dreamed of escaping to, the things she wanted but couldn't have. And Aaron would listen, patiently, lovingly, never pushing, but always present. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Zuri turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember my mother." Aaron froze, his heart racing. He had known there was a past Zuri carried with her, one she wasn't ready to share, but he had never pushed her to speak of it. He wasn't sure she would ever be able to. Zuri looked up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion Aaron couldn't quite read. "She told me that one day I'd find someone who would take care of me," Zuri continued. "I think maybe you're that person." Aaron's chest tightened with emotion, a tear threatening to escape his eye. "I'll always take care of you, Zuri," he said, his voice rough with the depth of his promise. Always. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that moment, both of them understood something that had been there all along. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And they were on that journey together. Breaking the silence, the days began to stretch into a long, quiet pattern that was slowly becoming a comfort to Aaron. Zuri's progress, though slow and unsteady, was real. Every word she spoke, every quiet interaction they shared, felt like a hard-won victory. But even as the house grew warmer with their shared moments, a quiet undercurrent of tension remained between them. Aaron could sense it. A heaviness in Zuri that was more than just silence. It was the weight of secrets buried deep within her, secrets that even she was not ready to face. It had been a few weeks since that night when Zuri had finally spoken of her mother, and since then, she had started to open up in small, almost imperceptible ways. She had shared a bit more about her life before coming to Aaron, pieces of a story that were fragmented and broken, but it was a start. Yet there was one thing that Zuri hadn't said, one truth that lingered between them, unspoken, unacknowledged, but always present. The truth about her past. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, Zuri finally broke the silence. She had been staring at the photo of Emma, Aaron's late wife, that rested on the mantel. The picture was of Emma and Aaron together, taken during a summer vacation several years ago. Emma had always loved the beach, and the photo captured the joy of a simple moment, Emma's laughter filling the air as she held Aaron close. Zuri had been fascinated by the photo ever since she first noticed it. Today, however, she didn't simply look at it as she had before. Today, Zuri turned to Aaron, her voice tentative but clear. "Who is she?" she asked quietly, her finger tracing the edge of the frame. Aaron paused, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't expected her to ask about Emma. Not yet, anyway. He hadn't been sure if Zuri would ever be ready to ask. But there was something in the way she asked the question, something that made Aaron feel like this was a moment of significance. "That's Emma," Aaron said softly, his voice a little rough with the weight of the name. "She was my wife. She passed away a few years ago." Zuri's gaze softened as she studied the picture again. "She's beautiful." Aaron smiled, though it was bittersweet. "She was," he said quietly. "She had a way of making everything feel lighter. I miss her every day." There was a long pause as Zuri continued to look at the photo, her expression thoughtful. She didn't say anything else, but Aaron could feel the wheels turning in her mind. She had seen enough of the world now to know that the love he had for Emma was deep, real, and irreplaceable. He could see it in her eyes. Zuri was beginning to understand the complex nature of love and loss, something she had never had the chance to fully process in her own life. As the days wore on, Aaron found himself growing more and more concerned with how Zuri was handling her own emotions. She was still so closed off, still holding on to something that, Aaron feared, was too painful to confront. He knew that the road to healing for Zuri would be long, but he also knew that without addressing the core of her pain, she would remain stuck, frozen in the past. It was one evening, several days after the conversation about Emma, that Aaron finally decided it was time to ask her directly. He didn't know if she would be ready to talk, but he had to try. They were sitting together on the couch, the soft hum of the house filling the air, when Aaron spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Zuri," he began, "I know you're holding something inside. I can feel it. I don't know what it is, but I want you to know that you don't have to carry it alone. If you're ready, you can tell me what happened. I won't push you, but I want to be here for you." Zuri's body stiffened at his words. She didn't look at him, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as though she could hold herself together by sheer force. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Aaron could see the battle taking place inside her, the tug-of-war between wanting to share her truth and the overwhelming fear of what it might cost her. "I don't." Zuri's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't think I can." Aaron reached out slowly, placing his hand gently over hers. "You don't have to do it all at once, Zuri, but when you're ready, I'll listen." There was another long pause, and for a moment, Aaron wondered if this was one of those moments when the silence would win out, when Zuri would retreat into herself once again. But then, very slowly, Zuri shifted her body, turning slightly toward him. I remember the night I left," she said, her voice trembling. "I remember running. I remember the sound of footsteps behind me, getting closer, and the fear that they were going to catch me." Aaron's breath caught in his throat. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to rush her. He simply sat quietly, his heart breaking as Zuri began to speak of the things that haunted her. "I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. I just ran and ran until my legs gave out, and I ended up on the streets, alone. It was dark. So dark." Zuri's voice cracked, and for the first time, Aaron saw the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. Her eyes were wide, filled with the pain of the memories she was reliving. "I don't even know how long I was out there," she continued, her words coming out in uneven gasps. "But I remember seeing him, the man who took me in. He wasn't like the others. He was kind. He told me I was safe, and he brought me to a shelter, but he never told me who he was, and I never asked." Aaron's heart ached as he listened, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had no idea how deep her trauma ran, how much she had been through before she had come to him. And yet, in spite of it all, Zuri had survived. She was here. She was alive. And that meant there was hope. "I think I loved him," Zuri said quietly, almost to herself. "But I was so scared. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know how to trust." Aaron gently squeezed her hand, offering her a silent comfort. "It's okay, Zuri. You don't have to explain anything right now. You've been through more than anyone should have to go through. But I want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever you need." Zuri's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Aaron feared she might pull away again. But instead, she leaned into him, her small body trembling with the force of the emotion she had been holding inside for so long. "I just want to forget," Zuri whispered, her voice breaking. I just want to forget all of it. Aaron held her close, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He knew it wasn't that simple, but he also knew that, together, they could start to rebuild, not by erasing the past, but by learning to live with it. The truth unraveled. The days after Zuri's painful revelation were filled with a heavy silence that hung like a storm cloud between her and Aaron. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was different, more charged, more fragile. Zuri had opened a door that Aaron wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. And yet, in the moments when she spoke, her words felt like an offering. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She wasn't pushing him away. Instead, she was slowly, carefully, showing him the parts of herself she had hidden for so long. Aaron didn't rush her. He didn't push her to open up more than she was ready to. He simply stayed by her side, offering her the one thing he knew she needed most: patience. The process of healing wasn't something that could be rushed, no matter how much he wished he could take away her pain. But as each day passed, Zuri began to show small signs of change. She started to open up more in subtle ways. One evening, after a quiet dinner, she asked him if they could take a walk. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was something. A willingness to move beyond the confines of their shared space, a sign that Zuri was starting to take tentative steps toward healing, and Aaron couldn't help but feel hopeful. They walked side by side, the cool evening air brushing against their skin as they strolled down the path that wound through their quiet neighborhood. The world around them was peaceful, the streets lit with the soft glow of street lamps, and the sky above them clear and vast, with the first stars beginning to make their appearance. Zuri didn't say much at first, content to walk in silence, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. But Aaron could sense the shift within her, the way her shoulders were a little less tense, the way she no longer felt the need to keep her distance from him. After a few minutes, Zuri spoke, her voice soft but steady. When I was younger, I used to think that if I just ran far enough, everything would go away, that the pain would stop. But it never did. It just followed me. Aaron felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her. He knew the weight of those words all too well, how easy it was to think that distance could erase the past. But the truth was, the past never truly disappeared, no matter how far you ran. It always lingered in the background, waiting for you to face it. You're not running anymore, Aaron said quietly, glancing at her. And you don't have to face it alone. Zuri stopped walking and turned to him, her eyes filled with something Aaron couldn't quite name. It was a mixture of gratitude, pain, and something else, a flicker of trust, as though she were beginning to believe in the possibility of healing. I'm scared, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if facing it makes it worse? What if I can't handle it? Aaron gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheek. You don't have to do it all at once. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here, Zuri. I always will be. There was a long pause as Zuri looked at him, her expression unreadable. But then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said, her voice a little stronger now. Okay. The rest of the walk was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. One filled with understanding, with the promise of something more. Zuri wasn't running anymore. She was choosing to stay, choosing to face her past, and that in itself was a victory. Over the following weeks, Zuri continued to show signs of progress, small but significant. She would share more about her life before coming to Aaron, though much of it was fragmented, like pieces of a broken mirror. There were memories of the people who had come in and out of her life, moments of kindness and cruelty that she could barely make sense of. But even as she shared these pieces of her story, Aaron could see the toll it took on her. The emotions were raw, unfiltered, and every time she spoke of her past, it was as though a part of her was reliving it. But Aaron never faltered. He listened without judgment, without interruption, and with the same unshakable compassion that he had always shown her. Each time Zuri opened up, he saw a little more light in her, a little more of the person she was meant to be, beyond the darkness she had endured. And each time she finished a story, a part of her seemed to heal. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the atmosphere was different, calmer, more intimate. Erin had been reading, and Zuri was drawing in her sketchbook, a quiet concentration on her face. It was one of those moments that seemed almost ordinary, but there was something extraordinary about it. The comfort of silence shared between two people who had both been broken in their own ways, yet found solace in each other. Zuri set down her sketchbook and looked at Erin, her eyes thoughtful. She had been holding something back, something she hadn't shared with him yet, and now she seemed ready to speak it aloud. "Erin," she began, her voice hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you." Erin looked up from his book, his attention fully on her. "What is it, Zuri?" Zuri took a deep breath, as though preparing herself for something difficult. "I wasn't alone the night I ran," she said softly. "There was someone with me, someone who helped me." Erin's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. He had assumed that Zuri had been alone in her struggle, that she had been abandoned and isolated, but now she was revealing something that he hadn't expected. "I was with my sister," Zuri continued, her voice trembling. "Her name is Amina. She was the one who kept me going when everything felt like it was falling apart. But when we got separated, I couldn't find her. I thought she was lost, and I thought I would never see her again." Erin's breath caught in his throat. He had never heard Zuri speak of a sister before, and the sudden revelation filled him with a mix of emotions. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know what had happened to Amina, but he could see the fear in Zuri's eyes. This wasn't something she was ready to dive into fully, not yet. "I don't know if she's okay," Zuri whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know where she is. I never stopped looking, but I don't know what happened to her after that night." Erin felt a pang in his chest as he watched her struggle with the weight of those words. Zuri had carried this burden alone for so long, and now, with each revelation, the weight seemed to grow heavier. But Erin also knew something. Zuri had shared this with him because she trusted him. She was letting him in, piece by piece. "Zuri," Erin said softly, his voice full of compassion, "we'll find her. We'll figure this out together. I'll help you." Zuri looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I do," Erin said, his voice firm with the conviction of someone who had already made a promise. "We'll find Amina, I promise." In that moment, Zuri's guarded expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, Erin saw the flicker of hope in her eyes. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe together, they could find the peace she had been searching for all these years. A new beginning. The journey from pain to healing was never linear. Erin knew that much. But even though it had been a long and grueling process, there was a palpable shift in the air now. Something had changed in Zuri. It wasn't an instantaneous transformation, but it was there, deep within her, something that was beginning to take root. The search for Amina had become their shared mission, and with each passing day, Zuri seemed to become more and more determined. No longer the frightened, withdrawn girl who had arrived at his doorstep months ago. She was now someone with purpose. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She was trying to reclaim her life. Erin had never seen someone heal like this before, so slowly, so profoundly. Zuri had always been strong, even when she didn't realize it. But now that she had begun to speak her truth, the strength within her was becoming undeniable. And for Erin, the journey had been one of reflection. When he had first taken Zuri in, he had been so focused on her needs, so consumed with helping her heal, that he hadn't realized how much he had been healing himself. Her presence in his life had breathed a new sense of purpose into him. Zuri had come into his world like a storm, a reminder of the fragility of life and the power of connection. She had rekindled a part of him that had been buried under grief for so long. The ability to care, to love, to open his heart once more. But now, it was time to face the most difficult task of all. finding Amina. The search had taken them to various places, old shelters, anonymous tip lines, and public records. Each lead they followed brought a flicker of hope, and each one that turned cold left them both feeling drained and uncertain. Still, they didn't stop. Zuri's determination pushed them both forward, even when the weight of their mission felt unbearable. It was a rainy afternoon when they received their first real break. Aaron and Zuri were sitting in the living room, surrounded by stacks of papers, missing persons reports, old shelter records, and endless phone numbers they had dialed over the past several months. The rain beat steadily against the windows, adding to the weight of the moment. Zuri was on her phone, scrolling through the news when she suddenly froze. "Aaron," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. He looked up from his own papers, his heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Zuri didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed him her phone. On the screen was an article from a local news outlet, detailing a woman who had been found living on the streets not far from where they had been searching. The woman had been identified as Amina, and the article included a photograph of her, albeit a blurry one. Aaron's chest tightened as he scanned the article. The woman in the photo bore a striking resemblance to the girl Zuri had described, a mix of hope and terror in her eyes. The name was the same, Amina. It had to be her. "Is it?" Aaron's voice trailed off as he turned the phone toward Zuri, who was staring at it with wide, uncertain eyes. "I don't know," Zuri said, her voice trembling. "But it could be. It has to be." Without another word, they both stood, a shared sense of urgency overtaking them. They gathered what they needed: Zuri's identification, a few personal items, and the address listed in the article, and headed out the door, bracing themselves for what lay ahead. The hope that had been a constant undercurrent in their search now surged to the forefront. They were on the brink of something that could change everything. The drive felt longer than it actually was, as if the world outside had blurred into a haze of anticipation and uncertainty. Zuri was quiet beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers trembling. Her mind, Aaron knew, was racing with a mixture of fear, hope, and 1,000 other emotions that she had barely begun to unpack. When they finally arrived at the address listed in the article, they found themselves in a part of the city neither of them was familiar with. The buildings were older, the streets more crowded, and there was a quiet tension in the air. It didn't feel like a place anyone should have to call home, and yet it was where Amina had been found. Aaron parked the car, and together they made their way to a small building that looked like it had seen better days. The door creaked as they entered, the dim light from overhead casting long shadows in the hallway. They walked slowly, as though unsure of the next step, but each step they took seemed to bring them closer to something monumental. At the far end of the hall, they were met by a woman in her late 50s, wearing a faded apron. Her face was kind, yet there was a sharpness in her eyes, as though she had seen too much of the world's pain to be easily fooled. "You must be Zuri," the woman said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm Judy. Amina's been asking about you. I'm glad you found her." Zuri's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The flood of emotions that had been building up inside her finally broke free, and she was on the verge of tears. Aaron placed a steady hand on her shoulder, offering her the comfort of his presence as Judy led them to the small room at the end of the hall. When they entered the room, Zuri froze. Sitting in a chair near the window, staring out at the rain, was a woman who could only be Amina. Her face had the same sharp features, the same warm, dark eyes that mirrored Zuri's. But there was a weariness in her expression, a depth of pain that could not be ignored. She had clearly been through so much. "Amina," Zuri said, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's head snapped toward the sound of her name. For a moment, neither of them moved, as though the world had stopped, holding its breath. And then, Amina's face softened, and she stood, her legs unsteady, but determined as she approached Zuri. "Zuri," Amina whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I lost you." And just like that, the years of pain, fear, and separation seemed to evaporate, if only for a moment. The two sisters stood there, eyes locked, and in that instant, everything changed. The past, the separation, the trauma, the uncertainty didn't matter. What mattered was that they were together again. Aaron stepped back, giving them the space they needed. But even as he watched the reunion unfold, he knew that this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. There would be more healing to come, more stories to share, and more hurdles to overcome. But in that moment, as the sisters embraced, Aaron knew that Zuri had found what she had been searching for all this time: family. And together, they would build a new future.